All right, so our next story we're going to look at is The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And by the way, this has a feeling of realism to this story. It was first published in Esquire magazine in 1986. It later was part of a collection of stories that Viking published in a book form in 1990. The book received widespread critical acclaim and established Tim O'Brien as a major figure in Vietnam War literature. O'Brien was born in October 2nd on 1946. He was raised in Worthington, Minnesota. He attended Macalester College in St. Paul, where he took part in the anti-war movement and participated in war protests and peace vigils. He graduated with a degree in political science and planned to go to graduate school to study government when he was drafted. He resisted the impulse to defect to Canada and joined the infantry. While there, he received a Purple Heart for wounds. He always despised the war and everything about it. After the war, while pursuing graduate studies at Harvard, he wrote his first book. Since 1973, he's been a full-time writer, and The Things They Carried is a collection of interrelated stories, which made him a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in '93. Some historical context. The Vietnam War went from 1955 to 1975. It was one of our longest wars. The major context for O'Brien's book is this war. The war was fought between the North Vietnamese and its communist allies and the South Vietnamese, supported by the United States and other anti-communist nations. The reason the U.S. became involved in the complex war are complex, but the major impetus was the acceptance of the so-called domino theory. This was a belief that once Vietnam fell to communism, it would spread throughout Southeast Asia and shift the balance of power during the Cold War. So there was an intense U.S. involvement began. I mean, even though it started in '55, the intense U.S. involvement in the war didn't really begin until '65, when Johnson sent Marines to defend Da Nang airfield. From '55 to '65, the war was mostly between the two sides of Vietnam and the French, supporting the South Vietnamese, and the Chinese and the Russians, supporting the North Vietnamese. We got involved in '65. At the start of '68, nearly 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. Some of the most important milestones include the Tet Offensive in '68, the so-called Vietnamization in '69, the My Lai Massacre, and the end of the war in '75 with the capture of Saigon, or the fall of Saigon. So at home, we had a lot of protests. This was not a war that people supported. Young men were required to register for the selective service at the time and faced being drafted into the armed forces. While some young men of wealth and privilege escaped the draft by receiving things like deferments, our president received a number of them, other objectors were less fortunate, and they left and fled to Canada, or some of them just openly defied the draft and faced criminal charges. Jimmy Carter actually pardoned all individuals who dodged the draft in something like '77 or '78. The anti-war movement intensified at home between '68 and '70. Protests became more frequently, particularly at college campuses, and police presence increased in response to the threat of violence. So some of the important milestones at home include the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, both of whom were against the war. There were riots at the DNC in 1968. There was an uproar over the My Lai massacre, or disaster, depends on how you want to approach it. And finally, Kent State, a college, in 1970 had the National Guard actually shoot and injure a number of college students. And I think they even killed 5 or something like that. So here's the plot summary. The Things They Carried recount the experiences of Lieutenant Jimmy Cross's infantry unit before, during, and after Vietnam. Some of the big concepts to think about is love and shame. How do feelings of love and shame propel the soldiers' actions? Particularly our main character, who is in love with the girl back home and then feels shame when he thinks that his contemplation and obsession with her caused the death of one of his members of his troop. There's the individual and the collective. How do the soldiers appear as individuals? How do they sacrifice their individual identities to become part of a group? Truth. In what ways is truth subjective? What is the difference between story truth and happening truth? Morality. How can morality exist within the context of war? Can you be moral and still be a soldier? And finally, solitude and isolation. Can solitude and isolation intensify feelings of despair? So some of our literary elements here. We have point of view and narrative under the title story. The narrator of The Things They Carry. The narrator is unidentified, but in some of the other stories he is kind of called Tim O'Brien. But again, remember, because a character's name is the same as the author, doesn't mean they're the same people. Realism, the method of accurately describing the details, general attitude, and philosophy of ordinary life that favors confronting the realities of life instead of escaping or idealizing them. There's hyperrealism, which is lingering over details smaller than an ordinary observer would perceive. And then there's magic realism, which is weaving kind of fantastic or imaginary elements into the narrative that otherwise has all the features of an objective, realistic account. All right. Fact or fiction? There is kind of a question about the truthfulness of this book. O'Brien's response he says this in an interview. What I'm saying is that even with that non-fiction sound element in the story, everything in the story is fiction, beginning to end. To classify different elements of the story as fact or fiction seems to me artificial. Literature should always be looked at not for its literal truths, but for its emotional qualities. What matters in literature, I think, are pretty simple things. Whether it moves me or not, whether it feels true. The actual literal truth should be superfluous. And that's true. Once a thing's written down, there's always a sense of fiction to it. Even true stories. Because it's perceived through someone's ideas. So there's a certain bias. There's a certain elements that may be exaggerated, that weren't real. Perceived elements. So always view stories like this as fiction. Because even though they feel real, they aren't real. They're a certain kind of hyper perceived realism to them. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this story. One of the interesting elements of The Thing They Carry is the fact that weight is played around with, and how the imaginary weight of things like feelings and emotions are heavier on the soldiers than the physical weight. That's something to think about. By the way, I love this story.